Real quick about my background, I started my career at Intuit, so I was I actually got to interact with Bill Campbell when I was at Intuit, so I was really excited to see Marty talk about him. He was a great guy. I worked at a few startups after that as a product leader. I also founded my own startup, and then I became a product management consultant. So I've worked with a lot of companies here in the Valley to help them grow their teams and achieve product market fit. I also run a big meetup at Intuit in Mountain View every month called Lean Product. And that's where you can find me online. It's very rare. I'm really excited with my co-founders here to have an event where we've got so many product leaders. It's so rare that on these kind of special occasions, I like to share the most secretly guarded piece of product management wisdom that's out there. And that's the product manager's motto. And some of you may not know it, so I'm gonna open the kimono and share it with you guys here. Okay? It's a little bit like Spiderman. Who knows Spiderman's motto? Anybody? With great power comes great responsibility. The product manager's one is similar, it's just a little different. It's basically with great responsibility comes no power. We're all laughing on the outside, but we're crying a little bit on the inside because we would want a little bit of power. So we're responsible for a lot of things, and I like to say good PMs always fill a vacuum. Like, hey, if there's no one doing wireframes, guess who's doing wireframes? No QA, guess who's doing acceptance testing, right? And one of the things we're responsible for is the analytics and the success of the business. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. That's why I wrote my book on the Lean Product Playbook. I'm going to give a few copies away if you guys want to tweet. I'll pick some tweets out there. Again, Prod Leaders is the hashtag. If you want to throw that on there, that would be great. And when I take a step back and I work with so many different companies, I can't help but think of like a maturity model. You know, sometimes when you think about these capabilities, you think of a maturity model for analytics. This is kind of overly simplified just with 3 levels of unaware, aspiring, and world-class, just to kind of delineate what those things would be, and a few different areas, you know, as far as tracking. So if you're unaware, you're not doing anything, you might be doing it sporadically, and then obviously when you're world-class, you're doing it both broadly and deeply. On analysis, you know, sometimes people are doing ad hoc analysis, but they haven't got to the point where it's automated or recurring. You want to get to that point. And the key here is to think about, as I go through each of these areas, where is your team? Or which level is your team operating at? And where can you improve? And where does it make sense to improve? Testing and optimization, there's a lot of talk about A/B testing. A lot more people talk about doing it than actually do it. That's the other one. And then getting to some of the stuff that we were talking about today. Organization, you know, our teams, are there ownership for these metrics, right? The GEM model, do we have a growth team? Do we have an engagement team? Do we have a monetization team? Do we have clear ownership? And finally, culture. I really love Marty's comments about culture today. And do we have, you know, is it more intuition-based or data-driven, or do we have a continuous improvement mindset? So hopefully you guys can see where your teams are strong or weak and focus on those areas. But the process that I recommend, just to give people a tangible process, is what I call the Lean Product Analytics process. And it's a generic process that you can use in any business with any of your teams. And the first step starts out with identifying what your metrics are. Those of you that are more mature, you're like, yeah, we're already good. We've got that tracked. But if you're starting from scratch, this is the first step to figure out what do we need to be tracking, and then let's start tracking it so we can see where we're at, what I call baseline values. We want to start out with the ground truth of where we are today to help inform where we should be focusing. And once we've got, and there's a little bit of hygiene there. What you're tracking may not be accurate. You got to go back and fix it and get to the point where you believe the accuracy of what you're tracking. And then you can look across all your metrics that you're tracking and say, which one do we think has the biggest ROI, the biggest upside that we should be focusing on, right? Until you're tracking them all, you can't really do that. And then this is all at the global level for your product or business, right? At some point, you're going to look at the metrics and say, okay, the top one that we think we need to improve right now is this one, like a certain conversion rate, either growth or engagement. And then we pick that top metric and we go into a metric-specific optimization loop where we say, okay, we decided we're going to improve engagement. And then we go, what are all the team, this is the fun part, you get to brainstorm with your team, what are all our ideas for how to improve engagement? And then you run it through an ROI filter and you pick the highest one, and then you design and implement it, and you roll it out, and you see what happens to the metric. And you hope it goes up and to the right, but even if it doesn't go up and to the right, you've learned by going through that loop, and you're going to be iterating, right? And eventually you're going to find something that moves the needle on that metric, you're going to find something else and something else, you're going to get into a groove. And then what's going to happen is going to get harder and harder to move that needle as you knock out. Especially when you first do this, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, some easy wins. Over time, it'll get harder. And at some point, it'll make sense to go back to the global level and say, OK, we optimized that metric enough. What's the next metric that offers the best ROI right now? For a lot of people getting started or early with analytics, it can be a little overwhelming not knowing where to start. You know, some people are not tracking anything. Some people are tracking everything. They have data out the wazoo. One of my favorite frameworks is Dave McClure's Startup Metrics for Pirates. Who's heard of this one before? OK, so about 30% of the room. Good. So for the rest of you that haven't, I want to explain it. It's the acronym AARR because that's the 5 areas of the business. The cool thing about this model is that it applies to any business, right? Every business has to answer these 5 questions and has these 5 goals. The first is acquisition. How do we get people that know nothing about our product to our front doorstep so that they can become customers, whether it's our App Store page or our website or sales talking to them, whatever it is, that's the first A, acquisition. The second A is activation. Once we've got a prospect there, what percentage of those are we actually converting to customers? However we define a customer, if it means pulling out a credit card and subscribing or just doing a username and password. Then finally, by becoming customers, now they're actually using your product, right? And not everybody sticks around and keeps using your products. That's where the third one comes in, retention, which is what percentage of people continue to use our product over time. The fourth is referral. As a function of people using your product, they're going to tell other people about it, either word of mouth, or you might have like digital viral channels for social or community products, right? And that's the one that varies the most. You know, obviously, if you're in a B2B product, that may not be as important, but definitely the other ones are all definitely important. And finally, the last R is revenue. By virtue of people using your product, either they're paying you directly or you're monetizing them some other way, right? So the idea here is this, again, this applies to every business. So if you're getting started, this is a great way to say, where do we need to focus? Back to the ROI analysis, kind of a marginal point of view. Which metric is the one that offers the highest ROI where we are today? And I call that the metric that matters most. And the whole point is you want to focus on the right metric at the right time because it will change over time. You know, it may go from growth to engagement to monetization over time. And I think the first thing to focus on is to make sure you've got product market fit. Usually when I ask people this question, hey, if you have one metric for product market fit, what would you track? People throw out a lot of different things like NPS and sales and DAO, MAU and things like that. I really think that the most powerful metric for tracking product market fit is retention rate. So retention rate basically tracks what percentage of people are still active over time. It basically reflects repeat usage. And what I like to say is think about all the movies you've seen in your life. And then think about all the movies you've seen like 5 or more times. The list is a lot shorter, right? Because those are the ones that you go back to because you like them a lot. Same thing with restaurants, the ones that you go back to a lot. So, you know, I might have a great landing page and trick you into using the product, and then you go and use the product, and it's not good. You're not going to come back. But if you come and use a product, and you choose to come back and use it again, that means it met some value for you, basically, right? So retention curves basically, on the y-axis, they show you what percentage of users are coming back to use your product over time. And then on the x-axis, it's not calendar time. What you do is for each user, you re-index the number of days from when they first started using your product. And you take a bin of users and you do this, right? The first thing you see is the graph doesn't even go to 100%. Why is that? Well, sadly, this is real data for a real app. 80% of people never come back and use this app after the first time. This is real data from a mobile app. Those of you in mobile know how brutal mobile is. That's why the first thing every mobile app does is, hey, can you enable notifications? Hey, so don't forget about me when I'm in your pocket, right? And then it drops down, usually pretty steeply, and then it settles in. And I've shown the rosy picture, the rosy scenario here. If you're lucky, it will flatten out at some asymptote at some smaller value. Most V1 products, it doesn't do that. It goes to 0. That's based, and many products, it goes to 0. I'm going to share some data in a sec. It may be 30 days, it may be 60 days, it may be 90 days. It goes to 0. And in other talks, I talk about the leaky bucket metaphor. You can think of that line as basically the water level in your bucket. And most buckets leak to 0 until you start optimizing your product market fit, basically. At some point, your product's been around for a while. It doesn't make sense to throw all your users in one bin because hopefully your product's better now than it was 12 months ago. So that's where cohort analysis comes in. That's where you basically divide up your user base and you compare the retention curves across them. It's most typically done by the month that you start up. Like, hey, let's take the January users and look at their retention curve in February and March. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could be by acquisition channel. It could be by any other kind of customer segmentation criteria. But let's do a quick look at, this is 3 cohort curves. Again, we've got percentage of users returning on the y-axis. We've got weeks since they signed up on the x-axis instead of days now. And we've got 3 cohorts. And what I want you to do is think about which cohort would you like to have for your product. We have cohort A with blue, cohort B, red squares, cohort C, green triangles. Who would like to have cohort A as their cohort? Who would like to have cohort B as their cohort? Who would like to have cohort C? Okay, at the break, did you get, okay, when Dan puts a slide up, we're all going to say C. It's pretty cool like that everybody just magically knows that. Why is that the one that wins? Why is that the one you like? I know this one's got the highest number of 50%, the blue line right here. It's the highest value at the end, right? Like if it flattens out, what's the value? right? And a lot of times when I give my other talk, it's more about qualitative research, and I get some quant jocks that are like, yeah, but Dan, you're talking to 10 people. How do you really know if you have product market fit? Like beyond a shadow of a doubt. This is the statistically significant behavioral data for product market fit. Basically, whatever that number is, if it flattens out, if it's non-zero, if it's zero, you don't have product market fit. The higher up it is, the more product market fit you have, right? This is attitudinal data, hopefully at scale, statistically significant, you can see what's going on. And what you want to see over time, once you realize that is, okay, let's say we launched our MVP like 24 months ago, and this was the curve that we had. We actually did a good job and got a non-zero one. And then in the next 6 months, we listened to customers, we fixed bugs, we fixed UI issues, we improved our value prop, we added features, right? And we messaged it better. What we want to see is your whole curve move up over time, and most importantly, that terminal value go up over time. This shows that you're improving product market fit over time. And basically, one of the morals of this is if you're not tracking your retention rate, you need to be if you really want to know what's going on with your product market fit. And there are some great third-party tools out there to do that. So don't think a lot of places like, oh, we got to build this ourselves. Usually analytics is a mix of homegrown plus third-party. For retention, you're better off just doing third parties. And I like to back these things up with real-world data when I can. So I was really excited when this data came out from the Android App Store. And they did a cohort. They did 4 cohorts, and they did it in a very specific way. They said, let's take the top 10 apps and create that be at the top red line cohort. And then let's take the next 500 apps, 50 apps, sorry, and make that be the orange line. And then let's take the next 105,000. You can see that it totally shows that the best apps, the ones that are most successful in the App Store, are the ones that have the highest retention levels, terminal values, which means the highest level of product market fit. You can also see how quickly it drops off, right? These guys are sitting up here at 55%. These guys are below 40. These guys are at 20. These guys are at 10. And if you averaged everybody in the store, it would go down to 0 because, again, most apps, the bucket leaks and they don't have product market fit. So we want to focus on retention first. Usually what makes the most sense is retention first up to a point, then conversion optimization up to a point, so that when you finally move on to acquisition, you're going to get much more bang and ROI for your acquisition efforts and money that you're spending. At some point, once you've done that, the cool thing about the startup metrics for Papyrus models, it applies to every business. The flip side is it's not unique to your business. When it comes to optimizing revenue, then you're going to have to actually get specific about your revenue model. And that's where the concept of the equation of your business comes in. And going back to my engineering roots, if there's something that I want to optimize, I like to express it as an equation, right? If for your business, you may be wondering, what equation can I use? Well, every business has profit equals revenue minus cost. That's not actionable. You can't say, hey, team, grow revenue, go, right? That's not actionable. So the idea is we're going to peel the onion and break each of these terms down to where they get to actionable things that we can have discussions and debates on our product teams about, do we think this one has the highest ROI or this one, basically, right? And we usually focus on revenue because the marginal revenue is constant or grows, whereas the cost goes down for most tech businesses. But if cost is important, you can break that down too. And then finally, this is for a certain time period, like a given quarter, year, or month. And what I'm going to do is break it. Who has a subscription business model? Any SaaS subscription? Okay, so we'll break that down. And so for a given month, the amount of revenue that we generate, we can break down as, well, for that month, how many paying users did we have, times what was the average revenue per paying user? ARPU is probably a term that you've heard before, right? On the paying users, we can break that down into, well, who was a new paying user this month, and how many repeat paying users did we have that were paying us before and paid us again? It's almost always beneficial to distinguish between new versus returning customers. And then the repeat paying customers, we can actually express as, well, from the last month, how many paying customers did we have? And times 1 minus our churn rate. And most of these terms are you just multiply them. But this is the first time, because of that 1 minus value, that churn rate, even small changes in churn rate can have huge impacts on revenue. And again, the idea is we can write this all out longhand to see what the revenue impact would be. Back on the paying side, let's say we had a free trial. So we had a certain number of trial users, we had a conversion rate, and then our trial users came from various channels, and we have kind of a conversion rate for the different acquisition channels that we have, right? So here we've peeled the onion. This isn't the only way to peel the onion. There's different ways to peel it. If you have a different business model, I have other examples online from other talks. But now we can have discussions saying, hey, do we think it's best to focus on improving our trial conversion rate, from prospects, getting our trial to paid conversion rate better, growing revenue per user, or decreasing our churn rate? We can have those discussions. When I was in the Navy, I worked on submarine design. I don't expect anybody to know what this is. This is called a gauge board. So in the back of the submarine or the boat, basically, this is your dashboard of the key metrics for like how the submarine is operating, like the temperatures and pressures and things like that, right? This is how I envision when I'm looking at the dashboard of the key metric for my business. And the key thing is to view each metric. The metaphor I like is to view each metric that you're trying to optimize as a gauge or a dial. And a gauge or a dial has a minimum possible value, 0 in this case. This would be good for a percentage metric. It has a maximum possible value, and it has a current value. I couldn't find one that had an arrow that wasn't at 0, so imagine that, right? But for each metric, that's when we're getting into figuring out the upside potential, we want to think about what's the min, what's the max, and where are we at today. And what we want to do is identify the critical few metrics, right? For each of those metrics, what's the upside potential? How much do we think we can move the needle? How many resources is it going to take to move the needle? The revenue impact we can figure out from the equation of our business, right? If this goes up 10% and it's a straight multiplier, then we know it's going to grow revenue by 10%. And on the dev resources, you want to figure out, usually it's developer time, right? And we want to basically figure out which ones offer the best ROI. So we want to do an ROI analysis where we have return on the y-axis and investment on the x-axis. The return, when we're talking about revenue or users, we can kind of use real numbers, but don't get tripped up on that. Even if it's just low, medium, high, it doesn't have to be super precise numbers, but you want to have some measure that the team agrees on relative value. And then usually for the developer weeks, you can have more detailed answers there, basically. Detailed, estimates from people. So let's say we have 2 ideas for how to move this metric, idea A and B. The team agrees they both are going to move the metric about the same. But idea B is going to take twice as much effort as idea A. Then obviously, idea A has twice the ROI. So that's a pretty easy, straightforward prioritization call. A lot of times, you've got a lot of different features that have different return and investment values, but they're roughly pretty much the same ROI. So here we've got idea C, 2 for 2, idea D, 4 for 4. They offer the same ROI. In general, my advice is to basically go for the smaller scope idea. One, it's going to get in market quicker. You're going to see the value quicker. You're going to get the feedback and learning more quickly. The other thing is, as we all know, scope estimation error is nonlinear, right? So the chances of this guy slipping is a lot less than that one slipping a lot, right? If I say, hey, yeah, I'll have that to you in a day, maybe I'll slip a day or 2. But if I'm like, yeah, I'll have the enterprise software for you in 18 months, it could easily slip to 20, 24 months, right? There are obviously bad ideas out there, like idea F. The team usually thinks it's going to be up where D is, right? They start out saying, we're going for D, and they feel the pain, they feel the investment as they're working and working and working, but because they don't kind of use modern customer validation techniques and lean startup kind of thinking, the return ends up being a lot lower. We as product people want to come up with identify the high ROI ideas, work with our teams to identify those by really understanding users. And then I think good product folks are able to work with their engineering counterparts. There's always 80-20 at play where you can shave off some of the effort. And when you do this, you can kind of basically sort the ideas by ROI, and you get the typical diminishing return curve as far as your backlog for how to move those metrics. And when you do this, there are 3 main ROI situations that you see. The first is what I call a good ROI situation. So what I'm showing here is the return, the investment. The yellow dot is where are we today with that metric? What's the current value of that metric? And the white line represents, hey, if we pursue pretty much like the best ideas that are possible, what can we expect to see for ROI improvement, basically, right? And so we're down here, and so with just a little bit of improvement on investment, we can see a lot of vertical improvement on return. So that's a good ROI. There's bad ROI situations. Same curve, but now the yellow dot where we are today is much higher. And so even if we put in a lot of investment, we're not going to move the needle that much on the return. So those are the 2 that you most commonly see. But there is a third category I call great ROI, where it's just fundamentally a different ROI curve. I also call these silver bullets, where by analyzing the situation, you may realize that, hey, with a little bit of investment, it can have a lot of leverage and really move the needle a lot on this metric. And especially if you haven't done analytics optimization yet, some of these can be lying around waiting to be found. So what I want to close out with is a case study of applying this lean analytics process. It's from a little bit ago. Does anyone remember Friendster here back in the day? All right, cool. We're showing our age up here on the stage. So I was the head of product for Friendster back in the day. And when I came into Friendster, there were 50 people. And like a good product leader, I went and talked to everybody. I said, what do you think is important? What do you think we should be focusing on? There was complete consensus that what was important was to do viral growth. We need to get more users from our existing users without paying for any users at all. So all right, cool. Everyone agrees on that. That's great. I'm like, what have you guys done so far? They're like, nothing. I'm like, okay. So first thing I'm going to do is figure out what metrics I need to start tracking, because we weren't tracking any of those metrics, right? In order to track the metrics, I had to kind of create a viral loop that I was going to then instrument with analytics. So the loop that I created was basically, hey, we have active users. They invite their friends who basically prospective users. They get an email from an invitation email. They either click on it or they don't. They get to our reg page. They either get through the reg process or they don't. The ones that do become users, a certain portion of which are active and can go on to invite other people. So that was kind of the framework. And then I said, great, what metrics are you going to put on top of this? And I don't have time to get into it. Basically, ratio metrics are very powerful, where they're percentages and things like that versus atomic or raw metrics, because they're much more easy to compare over time with scale, right? Scale independent, volume independent metrics. So I basically, here I put percentage of users who are active, because only the active users invite. Not everyone, all the active users were sending invites. So what percentage of invites were sending, of users were sending invites? There's a second thing here is when they invited their friends, they can invite 1, 2, 3, 5. So there was like, when they invite people, how many on average do they invite? For the email, there was a click-through rate. And for the reg process, there was a conversion rate. And if you multiply those 5 together, that's kind of the equation of the business for Friendster's viral loop. And as the brand new head of product with not a whole lot more information, I had to figure out, which of these should I go after? Of these 5 should I focus on? So I want you to pretend that you're the head of product back in the day for Friendster. Let's make it easier. Let's make it 3. We'll narrow it down to 3, OK? So the choices are you can focus, you think it's, and I know you don't have a lot of information, but I'm going to ask everybody to pick one and vote. Who would focus on improving the percentage of users sending invites? OK. Who would focus on trying to increase the invite sent per sender? And who would focus on the registration conversion rate? OK, that's the winner by far. So the next step in the process, remember what it was? Anybody? What's the baseline values? Right? So I intentionally pulled the audience before I showed you the baseline values, just so you can see the power of just knowing 3 numbers. Ready? These are the numbers now. So this one is at 15%. That's at 2.3. That's 85%. You didn't suddenly become experts in social networking, did you? But why don't we revote? OK? Who would focus on percentage of users sending invites now? Oh, we got a lot more hands now. Who would focus on invites per sender? And who would focus on reg conversion rate? That one went way down. I like to show that example just to show that even if you just get the baseline value, you suddenly have much more information. It's kind of like the cohort thing. Your brain just kind of knows. What is that hack that's going on in your brain? I like to call it the upside potential of a metric hack. So let me walk you through that. Remember I said each metric is a dial? It has a min value, has a max value, and has a current value, right? For the registration conversion rate or process yield, it's a percentage. So the min is 0. The max is 100. Where are we today on this one? We're at 85. Not knowing anything else, I can tell you what the max potential improvement is, right? I can say it's 15 percentage points. I'm not saying we could do it or can't do it, but it's 15 percentage points max. If we express that as a percentage of where we're at today, max possible improvement of 18%, right? The second one, it's also a percentage. Percentage of users sending invites, 0 to 100, we're at 15, right? Just by looking at the graph, you can see there's a lot more upside. Not saying you could get it or if you could get it, right? But if we run the numbers, there's 85% headroom on 15. It's 570. That's why it's a no-brainer for your brain to say, oh, I think, not knowing anything else, I want to go for that one. How about the third metric? Average number of invites sent per sender. What's the min? 0. Great. What's the max? Infinity. To infinity and beyond. How many people on in the earth? 7 billion. How many on the internet? So everyone gets excited, right? But it's fundamentally different, right? 0, and we're at 2.3. And so we have like x divided by 2.3 equals y, right? And so you eventually get down to, well, how many friends do people really have? Maybe 150, 200. But even if you run the numbers with 150, 200, it still blows that second one out of the water, right? So it's important to think of min, max, and where we're at, because sometimes you get fundamentally different metrics like this. Is anyone feeling a sense of deja vu from something I said just a little bit ago? See a black cat walk across the stage here? Remember I said basically that there's those 3 ROI curves. There's a bad ROI curve. Well, that's the registration conversion rate, right? We're sitting there at 85%. It's going to take a lot. For a lot of effort, we're not going to be able to move the needle. There's a good ROI curve. That's the percentage of users saying invite. We're at 15%. There's probably a lot of things we can do to grow that quickly. And then finally, I don't know, but it seems like this other metric could be a silver bullet metric, because it's fundamentally different, right? Because we can go to infinity from 2.3, right? So for those reasons, we basically chose to focus on that. Okay, once we pick the metric, the next step in the process is brainstorming your ROI of your ideas, right? So what I also didn't tell you guys is back then, the way you invited people is you had to type in their email address. This is 2004. right? You had to type in their email address. You had to remember it. So no wonder people were getting tired after 2 or 3 and not sending it anymore, right? So our top idea was to build an address book importer. They're pretty common these days, but back then they weren't. Even then, we had to say, well, there's a certain amount of distinct engineering effort for each different email provider. So we picked the top one that was most represented. The engineers said, hey, it's going to take a week and a half of effort, so we did it. So here's the before and after. We were tracking along at 2.3 invites per sender, right? And this is a 7-day average curve, so it took a little while. We launched the improvement, and it more than doubled with just a week and a half, right? So it did turn out to be a silver bullet metric. Because of the viral loop, we got twice as many new users just by making that one change. This was our MVP. Because of success, we then went on to build the importers for the other tools. So I was pretty excited about that outcome. All right, so to sum up again, the lean product process, start out by identifying what your metrics are, figuring out the baseline values. I showed you guys the power of the baseline values today. Look across your metrics, figure out, do the ROI analysis to figure out which one is the metric that matters most right now. Then go into for that metric, then with your team, brainstorm, run an ROI analysis, launch it, and hopefully things go up and to the right. Real quick, I just want to mention I do run a meetup at Intuit in Mountain View. And I'm super excited to have Marika and Brian Tran from User Testing speaking there. They're going to talk about quant and qual on December 6th, so you can register there. And with that, I have time for a couple of questions before we break for lunch. Oh, yeah, cool.
In a B2B world where contract lengths are measured in years, how do you iterate quickly if you're aiming for retention as something?
Right. So the question was, hey, in B2B world, when we have multi-year contracts, how do you think about retention? I'm glad you bring that. This is like the number one question I get when I give this. People try to distinguish between purchase retention. It's like, Dan, why do I care about retention? They signed a 5-year contract. We got them. They're locked in. Versus usage retention, like are they actually using it? Fundamentally, retention is about repeat usage. And you can imagine in 2 scenarios. Scenario A, hey, we signed the 5-year contract. We gave the training, but it doesn't look like anybody actually really is sticking around and using the product anymore. And in scenario B, we did the training, about 80 people, 80% of seats are full, they're actively using it. Which one's going to get renewed in 5 years, right? So I think it's a little short-sighted to only focus on purchase retention. Usage retention is like a leading indicator of purchase renewal is how I look at it basically. So it's important to track both. You always want to look at your win-loss rate and your renewal rate, but I think usage is a leading indicator of purchase.
One more question.
Yeah.
Related to that, for usage retention, if you work in a product or industry where usage is not expected on a daily basis,
Yep.
such as travel,
Yep.
which I work on, how do you measure that retention?
It's tough. It's tough. The examples I think of, like people that have, the question was, hey, when you have a long period of time between repeat usages, how do you track retention basically, right? So things I think of are like people that most of their sales happens in the holiday season, or TurboTax is an example I like to use a lot. How many times do you guys use TurboTax? As few as possible in a year, one time per year. So you can track it, it just takes a long time. And retention is basically a behavioral metric. I like to distinguish between attitudinal and behavior metrics. If for some reason the behavior is too far out, then that's where you can lean on attitudinal metrics like NPS or customer satisfaction. You got to stay in touch with people in between. And then the flip side is to play offense, is to what can we do? What else can we do in the user journey to meet these needs to have more touch points with them so it's not so spread out, so they don't forget about you? And if you look at what TurboTax has done, they're trying to get into tax planning and other things so it's not just a one-year event. Quarterly estimated taxes, things like that.